everybody. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. For those of you who don't know me, which I'm sure is many of you, the only person who really knows me inside out is my mother, because saya semak sekali, and she obviously knows who I am inside out. But for those of you who don't know me, my name is Vila. Yes, I have an Indian name. That's because I'm biracial. This is going to be a very important point in our conversation today, because many of you dari Sabah pun darah campur-campur, and there is a point that I want to make about that in relation to kami orang punya conversation about laut or about the seas. I'm an anthropologist, ahli antropologi. Maksud dia dari segi formal, saya seorang pengkaji hubungan sosial antara manusia, and in this case saya punya area of expertise is Sabah. Tapi dari pandangan yang kurang formal sikit, seorang ahli antropologi tu, I call them professional bullshit artists, pasal that's my job. I just sit down and kupi-kupi and dengar cerita, and saya pun kasih tahu cerita. So that's basically the methodology of work of an anthropologist. For many years now, I've lived with orang kampung, whether or not they've been orang kampung from the migrant community or from the indigenous community. Again, this is a point that I try to make every time I speak to Sabahans, especially, simply because there is a big argument, debate, what have you, about siapalah orang asal dari Sabah, right? Why are you orang asal? Why orang asal deserve certain things? When are you an orang asal? This is a very important question, because kadang-kadang for most days, masa kau pergi beli new cap, kau tidak fikir kau orang asal. Tapi when political powers come into play, everybody argues that they are orang asal, right? So for me, these are very, very important conversations, but most importantly, to sort of glue atau gamkan a lot of these narratives, I make an argument that the sea is a very, very powerful tool in the way we see ourselves. So today's conversation, and it's more so of a conversation, it's not so much of a lecture, adalah berkaitan what we understand about shores and seas, right? Seas are supernatural, shores are haunted. And when I say berhantu, tidaklah saya bilang, go there bawa bomo and pergi dapat nombor, but haunted in the sense that many ways that Sabahans, I think particularly, or residents of Sabah, come into a point of deep reflection about identity, about belonging, about ethnicity. It's tied very much to a piece of space between water and land. Okay, so panjang saya cerita ni, but let's get to the point that I want to make, because this is supposed to help you get to the next session. So many of you would have seen this. So this is an image of life and the sea in Sabah. It is impossible. I use the term impossible. Walaupun kalau kau dari Ranau kah, kau dari Tambunan kah, Kundasang kah, kau dari Tongot kah, you would have seen this image. An image of life and the sea in Sabah. And I want to tell you a little story. This is the place where I lived, or one of the places I lived, for over a year in Sandakan. I did very, extensive research di situ. I was living with a community that is by and large what the Sabah state or what Malaysia calls non-citizens. Okay? Orang tidak berwarga negara, or stateless, all right? Very common term we use in Sabah. And this is a place where I spent all my time listening to stories. For me, or at least the point I want all of you to start thinking about is, why do Sabahans tell stories in the way they tell stories? And what is the value of a story in you understanding who you are, why your position is that in society, and what it means in the future? right? So of the many people, of the 30 people that I wrote about in my book, and yeah, I've written several books, but nobody reads this book. Even saya punya mama pun tidak baca buku tu. Kadang-kadang saya pun tidak baca buku saya sendiri. But in one of my more favorite writings, I spent 1 year speaking to 30 people. And of those 30 people, I met 2 in this kampung. The first one was a 16-year-old boy called Anazli, all right? This was one of my earliest foray into Sandakan, sometime in 2016. Now, Anazli, setiap malam, dia akan ikut dia punya parents pergi jual sayur at the Sandakan Pasar. Now, if any of you, ada siapa-siapa dari Sandakan kah? Tidak. Ada siapa-siapa pernah pergi Sandakan kah?
Ada.
Ada, okay. So, if you know, in many parts of in maritime Sabah, you will have a very big pasar situated right next to the ocean or the sea, all right? So, every night, Anazli and parents will sell. Malam, bukan pagi. Why? Because if you are tiada document, you can't get an official place to sell dalam pasar. So you'll sell it outside of the pasar satu malam. Apa-apa saja kau jual. Ikan kah, sayur kah. But in this case, Anazli's parents were vegetable sellers. And malam-malam tu kalau kau 15-16 tahun, penat ba, right? Even though there are many kids just like you. And one of the interesting things he used to tell me was when I asked him, jadi kalau malam-malam sudah penat, pergi tidur mana lah ni? And he'll say, oh, sana-sana tepi pantai, right? By the shore. And I said, tepi pantai, you know, why would anybody sleep by the shore? Like you would think sleep underneath a shop lot or, you know, dalam kereta. But that is my privileged point of view, right? I have the privilege to have a car or sleep on a bed. And that's not the case for many people. Even though they might have beds at home, it's not the condition that they can return to at night all the time. So Anazli said, tidak, saya pergi situ sama saya punya kawan-kawan, right? But there is a time in the night when kami banyak berpikir lah, kali banyak isap rokok juga kan? So you know, and what Anazli was trying to tell me was that the sea or shores are stimulants for thought processes for many of us, right? You go there and after a while, people are marveled. All right, they are wowed by what they see at seas or shores. So one of the things that he told me, and I remember this very well, is that he talks about the fact that the sea is actually a very powerful gift from God. So his line is, hidup kami memang kucar-kacir pasal pas meaning document, or tiada pas. Kerajaan pantau kami, mau kasih usir. Kalau dekat laut, rasa tananglah sikit. Laut itu anugerah Tuhan. Tepi pantai ni ada juga terpikir. Kami ni anak muda Sabah, orang Sabah. Bilang apa saja dorang, tetap je setia sini. Right? I thought that was a very interesting thing that he said about seas. From the same kampung, I met another individual. And this individual became very close to me. And they chose the name Tokyo. Now, Tokyo is a transgender youth, and it must be incredibly difficult to be stateless and transgender. Incredibly. And in the few months that I knew Tokyo, I grew to understand and empathize and be very compassionate to the intersections of what it means to not just be stateless, miskin, kadang-kadang sakit, but to also be queer, specifically transgender, an identity you cannot hide, was indeed very, very difficult for Tokyo to navigate. I met Tokyo almost a year and a half after I met Anazli. And for Tokyo, who used to jahit baju lah, dia punya kerja tu jahit baju. Dia jahit baju. Siapa saja. Kalau kamu kahwin pun dia boleh jahit untuk kau. Tokyo is incredibly talented. But the problem is Tokyo is presented to the community while, you know, on a personal level, the community accepted Tokyo as female, authorities will only recognize Tokyo as their birth gender, which is male. And so Tokyo was deported along with something like 54 men from her kampung. And it would take her something like 4 months to return back to Sandakan. In the conversation about her return, which was a very difficult conversation, saya ingat lagi dia bilang, when they arrive very close to the shore, tidak boleh bawa dia punya boat dekat-dekat dengan pantai, tidak boleh, kena jauh sikit, maybe about a little under 1 kilometer. And what Tokyo said was she remembered jumping into the water, swimming to the pantai, coming out to land, and just crying because of this feeling of being very overwhelmed by emotions. The feeling of elation and joy, yeah, some form of happiness, but also anger and sorrow. Many months later, when I had a goodbye conversation with Tokyo, Tokyo tells me again what shores and what the ocean means to her. She tells me, sinilah saya kalau mau nangis ka, marah ka, bercinta ka. Kali anak-anak macam saya ni, did I make a wrong this one here? Sorry. Kali anak-anak macam kami ni, macam pantai ba. Sab dua dunia kan, basah kering, dua-dua baru dan lama, lagi-lagi kedatang kemari, terpaksa terima hakikat lah. So I'm using these stories to sort of tell you these are obviously connections between the migrant community and also Sabah by way of the sea, right? But I also want to show you another image of life and the sea in Sabah. This is also satu lagi kampung air. You will see this every time you fly into KK Airport. Every time. This is Sembulan. And this is where I met Roger. Roger, which I literally just met, saya tulis May, belum lagi May. What I met was May last year. Sorry guys, typo, 2022. And Roger self-identifies as a Dusun Brunei. Dia bilang campur-campur lah, right? Roger works in a petrol station, but every day he travels back to his kampung air, which is located in Sembulan. And what's very interesting is Roger, born in Sabah, identified as orang asal, ada IC biru, pergi sekolah di kawasan Greater KK, right? Tells me this very interesting line. Dia bilang, selalu dorang bilang, tinggal di sini cuma pati saja. Nggak ada bah, asli bah saya ni ramai aja. Tapi pati pun nggak salah bahkan. Tu na, uncle saya kawin pati bah. I love the spelling of uncle. I love it because he specifically tells me when he writes to me on WhatsApp, he spells it out as uncle, which is specifically a Sabah way of saying uncle, kan? Lama sudah keluarga saya cari makan di laut. Cuma dorang bilang, kalau banyak lagi duit kerja di darat, nah pergilah. Alright? And this is why I continue to collect stories from people about the sea, because it really tells us a lot about what official documents don't tell us about being Sabah, but it doesn't tell us about space, what it doesn't tell us about identity, what it doesn't tell us about intercommunication between communities. There's a lot that you, all of you, kali sudah tahu dalam hati lah. And they are things that you experience every day, but you are told very differently when politicians or people of authority come and tell you otherwise, right? So these are some of the introductory stories that I want to tell you. What I really want you to think about today are 4 things. Number 1, this idea of identity and water. So ask yourself these questions, okay? Bagaimanakah kamu sebagai orang Sabah mencipta kau punya identity sendiri melalui laut, right? How do you invent or create your identities through the sea? Now, for those of you yang memang tidak tinggal dekat dengan laut, right? there must be some, how do I say, cerita or tales about the sea that you must have heard of. And the second thing I want you to think about is what are these stories of the sea in the creation of these identities? Are they uniting you or are they dividing you? Menyatukan kah, memisah? Okay. The second thing is we have to ask ourselves, satu Sabah ni memang dia dikelilingi laut lah. Who owns it? Who owns the sea? And on top of that, is ownership the same as control? Does the government own the sea or control the sea? Do communities own the sea or control the sea? Right? Number 3, this is also a very important point. This is kira kami punya methodology lah. How do we get to the points we want to get, right? People tell stories. And what do these stories mean? Have they impacted you? Do they make you now think about what it means to be Sabahan? And lastly, on top of everything else, as an anthropologist, we are always told to remind people there is power somewhere. There's a power relationship somewhere. In any relationship, even antara kau boyfriend, girlfriend pun, suami isteri, ibu sama anak, right? Government and rakyat. There is a power relation. So when we bring the seas in, you must ask, are people powerful because they control the seas? Or are seas powerful because they control people? Before we carry on, this is the part where it's very heavy. It's heavy because, well, you know, my job is to talk about very heavy things, but also I want you all to have some information before I say goodbye to you and you move on to the next session. All right? There are many important information about Sabah that oftentimes dibincangkan secara cerita-cerita di kopitiam sejak lah. Alright? How do we take what we have and put them into information? First of all, you must understand there are 3.9 million of us. And when I say us, I mean Sabahans. And this is an estimated population of Sabah. This number might have grown. These numbers might have depleted. We do not know. Because census, banci ya, dia tidak diambil setiap tahun, dia diambil sekali 10 tahun. So these numbers can change accordingly. This is just an estimation, all right? And within this 3.9 million, scholars have also made an estimation that there are over 100 ethnic and sub-ethnic group. Saya kasih campur lah, ethnic and sub-ethnic group. All right? So an ethnic group would be the dusun, a dusun tatana will be a sub-ethnic group, right? And just as I told you that I am of campur-campur descent, the rate of intermarriage in Sabah is 4 times the national average. That means the number of people who are biracial di Sabah, ada darah campur, ada ethnic bercampuran, is 4 times more likely, you are 4 times more likely to be of mixed descent in Sabah. All right, these are things that I want you to think about when you think about who you are and where you belong to and things like that. But a very important note that I must put here on the slide is that even though we are using things like census macam banci kan, unfortunately the data that we get on Sabah is constantly or should I say the accuracy and consistency of the public data is very limited. Maksud dia, there are some categories memang tidak pernah diisi dari dulu lagi. When in fact in a state like Negeri Sembilan atau Pahang, dia tiap-tiap kali akan diisi. Tapi untuk kami, there are many missing informational gaps. Alright, so there's only so much we can do. And this is why we are constantly making estimations about Sabah. For those of you who've always wondered, actually saya ni orang asal, tapi macam mana saya ni orang asal lah? Well, technically, Sabahans can be divided into 3 indigenous groups, 3 major indigenous groups. Number 1, kalau kau KDM, this is what you call Bornean stock, all right? Bornean stock. We use the term stock for communities yang biasanya ada banyak bercucuk tanam a little bit further from the sea. All right, that means we call them the plains or highlands. So for many of the KDMs, traditionally, we would consider you Bornean stock. And then there are groups from what we call wider Malay archipelago. Malay archipelago, for those of you yang tidak faham, pernah dengar perkataan Nusantara? So Malay archipelago is the Nusantara, right? And Sabah, of course, is in the heart of the Nusantara juga. Why are we known as the Nusantara? Because we are part of island clusters. Sabah is a part of Borneo, which is a giant island in the Nusantara. Now, for many of the people in the Nusantara or the wider Malay archipelago punya kategori, biasanya is under Bajau dan Suluk. However, now I'm not going to talk about, saya ni orang Rungus, tapi ada juga orang bilang yang saya ni orang Nusantara. We will get into that conversation in a while. All right? And then Malay groupings. That means groupings that have come outside of the Nusantara ideology that has been packaged as Melayu. All right? Simply because when kau punya nenek moyang datang, misalnya orang Bugis datang pergi ke Sabah, ada juga orang Bugis yang travel pergi ke Malaya or closer to Malaya, like say for example Medan, okay? And because of the sort of political framing, you guys today fall under a category called Malay grouping. So we're talking about, say, the Bugis community dari Indonesia or the Bruneian Malays. This is a very rigid way of looking at identity di Sabah, but this is the way it has been discussed in academic or in statistical conversation. Selain daripada yang tiga ni, it is also important for us to mention non-Bornean groups, Chinese, Indian, other population types. There are many Pakistanis that have arrived in Sabah, all right? And some of you might say, kalau orang Filipin ni macam mana ni orang Filipin? That's a conversation, isn't it? That's a huge conversation. Now, some people may agree that they fall under wider Malay archipelago groups, but there are some who argue that people who have Philippines connection can also fall between Bornean stock and the Malay groupings, right? Again, very big debates about this. I'm not here to get into that argument. I'm here to tell you how we think about this. However, we must remember, memang ada banyak lagi dia punya cultural and religious backgrounds that is not listed explicitly in the census. And this is a problem. This is a huge problem because we unfortunately have been trained to depend on the banci to define who we are. Right? Why? Because kalau dorang bilang mau kasih sama orang Bumi Putra BRIN, atau mau kasih duit, atau mau kasih financial aid, atau mau kasih apa lagi, subsidi, kan? Kalau kau kerja sebagai petani ikan nelayan, placing yourself within the banci helps you. But what happens on the ground is completely different. All right? Now, on top of that, sudahlah kami bincang bangsa, okay? We also have to understand there are various degrees of being indigenous in Sabah. There are merangkumi scale-scale yang lain, skala-skala yang berbeza. Dia punya intensity, kamu punya keasalan itu berlainan. Now, on the most on the most general level, majority of us are Bumi Putras. And the translation for that means prince of the soil. Bumi, soil, Putra, prince. Alright? In the simplest of English, kalau kau Bumi Putra, kau boleh bilang, I'm indigenous Malaysian, which would mean orang asal Borneo, which includes Sabah, Sarawak, and Malay people of the peninsula. Alright? Does this include our friends, the orang aslis? You know the sad truth? No, it doesn't. Orang aslis, while they are indigenous, are not given Bumi Putra privilege. Why? We are not going to get into that right now. You can have a conversation with that about me, but it's simply because of something called political will. All right. Anyway, if you are Bumiputra, it would mean that under Article 161A of the Federal Constitution, you have something called special position. Okay. This is a general idea. How it is enforced on the ground, itu lain cerita. Okay. However, in my time of doing work di Sabah and also Sarawak, I have, it is important that we also mention there are many people who don't call themselves Bumiputra. Orang bilang saya pribumi. Saya orang pribumi. Alright? Pribumi, translation dia lain sikit daripada Bumiputra. It means I'm first of the soil. Orang pertama di atas tanah ini. And the term pribumi essentially came from Indonesia or within the Nusantara thinking. So ramai yang kali daripada Nusantara stock tu ada juga yang dorang gunakan perkataan pribumi sampai sekarang. And the term pribumi is still used in Indonesia today and some southern Philippines community. Mesti lagi dorang guna perkataan pribumi. Especially kalau kau dari maritime Southeast Asia lah. Kalau mau pergi Vietnam semua tu ndak ada. This is only for this part of the Nusantara. However, as you know, pribumi has been adopted to unite indigenous political narratives. It's not so much about kau punya identity. It is a political narrative. And it was, I guess, hijacked. Saya guna perkataan hijack when Mahathir came back into power. So they used the term pribumi. And they were trying to popularize the term pribumi dari satu peringkat political lah. Okay, tapi there are some communities yang mesti lagi guna perkataan pribumi. And the last one, this is a very, very interesting category, anak negeri Sabah. Now, technically, or child of the state of Sabah, you are the child to the state, okay? Technically, anybody who is Bumiputra and orang asal should technically be an anak negeri Sabah, right? Because the anak negeri Sabah is a legal framework to protect orang asal Sabah. And this anak negeri Sabah title is a title is overlooked by the Native Court Judiciary Department under the Ministry of Law and Native Affairs. Now, kadang-kadang ministry ni ada, kadang-kadang tidak. Tengoklah siapa kau punya PM. Tengoklah siapa kau punya CM. Kalau kau suka kau punya CM, tidak suka kau punya CM, itu kau punya sendiri punya hal lah sekarang. Tapi dari segi where does the anak negeri Sabah fall under as a ministerial punya jurisdiction, that has been shifting in the last 10 years. Okay, but what we know is there is juga Mahkamah Anak Negeri. So at the core of it, the native court of the anak negeri yang menjagalah anak negeri Sabah punya title ni. But does every Bumiputra orang asal have an anak negeri Sabah title, yes or no?
No.
Very good. No. The answer is no. I used to get orang tanya, dokter saya ni orang Kadazan bah, padahal saya anak negeri Sabah kan? Well, yes, technically. But the problem with being anak negeri Sabah is you must have a special letter from the native court. You must have satu, kira macam bukan saja surat lah, macam satu certificate to acknowledge that you're actually an anak negeri Sabah. And what it means to be anak negeri Sabah is kau boleh beli native title land. Okay, tanah. The truth is, while many orang asal started their life generations ago as anak negeri Sabah, many of their children today are no longer anak negeri Sabah formally. Because the native court, the anak negeri Sabah punya native courts, mahkamah, does not give out these certificates and acknowledgements as often as they do anymore in protection of what they can. This has a lot to do also with the introduction of something like institutionalized Islam. So JAKIM coming and having powers in the state of Sabah has interfered with the way native courts can give out, because technically kau boleh kahwin di Mahkamah Anak Negeri sebagai anak negeri Sabah kalau only if you aren't Muslim, right? You can't get married there as a Muslim because then you have to go to Sharia court. So a lot of these, how do I say, involvements in different non-Sabahan institutions has also changed the way people see themselves as orang asal. Is there a Sabahan that is non-Bumi Putra? Of course ada. Mesti ada. Alright? The Department of Statistics Malaysia in 2012. 2012 lama sudah. So we should have one coming out this year or next year. I encourage you, ramai orang yang tidak suka lah kalau baca dia punya statistik dari Banci kan. But I make it a point to tell everyone that I have an opportunity to speak to. When it comes out, download it, read it, understand where Sabah doesn't have information and make noise. Because if we don't have information, we get data like this. 1.8 million people in 2012 were declared non-Malay Bumi Putras. All right. And what does it mean to be non-Malay Bumi Putra? It means that you will fall under KDM, Bajau, Rumus, Orang Suluk, Orang Sungai, so on and so forth. You make 53% of state population. All right. And these figures are said problematically to also include non-Malaysians as well. So a non-Malaysian or a non-citizen person might be somebody dengan kadang-kadang termasuk juga orang IMM 13 ya, apa ni surat burung-burung, somebody with IC merah, right? They would fall within this category. Now, why am I personally very critical of this? I'm critical of this because then we don't have transparency. This is not an issue of being xenophobic or being racist. This is an issue to say that political unhappiness and frustration continues because a number like 1.8 million is not clear. It's really not clear. People want to know how many of them are there simply because it is their God-given right to know. Okay, memang dorang punya hak untuk tahu. But if you add these numbers, if you include very different categories into these categories, then what happens is this number is a distrusted number. Dia tidak membawa apa-apa maksud. However, from my own personal research, I have found that there has been something like 108 to 110% growth of a non-Malaysian resident. This includes stateless people in the last 21 years in Sabah. So what it means is that if a family originally ada, for each person, say a mom, dia boleh lahir more than one or two people in their lifetime, but Sabahans are not giving birth to as many children compared to the number of people that non-Malaysian residents are giving birth to within Sabah. All right. I am personally of the position that many of the children specifically or new generation of non-Malaysian residents need to be given some sort of amnesty. They should be recognized and given, you know, very, very important assistance for health and education and, you know, proper outlets into jobs. But I also think indigenous communities need to have a say in the pace and the ways in which some non-Malaysian residents can eventually be Malaysians through proper channels. However, when we have categories like non-Malay Bumi Putras within the Banci dalam dia punya Banci in 2012, it also means that if you are Kadazan, Dusun, Murut, Bajau, Rumus, Suluk, Orang Sungai, what have you, you can also be misrepresented in the Banci. Okay. Now this sounds very heavy. I know you're asking what the hell does this have to do with the sea? I'm getting to my point, I swear. This is the area in which I'm slowly getting back to this whole loud argument, okay? It's called the multi or biraciality quandary. Quandary means masalah. It's a problem seen by only the state and nobody else in Sabah. Because everybody loves being multi-ethnic, right? Because it's so commonly found kalau di Sabah. However, the state expects Malaysian, and when I say the state, I mean the federal government, the Malaysian government, expects every Malaysian. Jadi kalau kau dilahirkan di Malaysia, kau memang ada dokumen Malaysia, you're Malaysian. Okay? The Malaysian government expects you to identify with only one single ethnic identity. Okay, dorang memang tidak suka lah kalau kau bilang, saya ni mama saya orang Bajau, bapak saya orang Dusun. Do you realize that orang Sabah sejak cakap begitu? Kau ni orang apa bani? Oh, mama saya begini, bapak saya begini. But the state government doesn't want that. And this is why Sabahans speak that way. Because apart from having one ethnicity in your identity certificates or documents, Sabahans think about their ethnic identity very differently on the ground. Tiap hari kalau they are going through life and they are interacting with other Sabahans, they think about it very differently compared to what is on their documents. All right, owing to political, religious, or cultural sentiments. That means a lot of the way they think about who they are influenced by politics and religion and culture. And when I say culture, there is actually, people always argue, is there such a thing as the Malaysian culture? We still don't have an argument. What does it mean to be Malaysian? But I can argue that a Sabahan culture is much prevalent than a Malaysian culture. All right? So what does it mean when I say Sabahans, kalau dorang pikir pasal dorang punya ethnicity ni, on the ground, dalam kehidupan harian dorang tu, it feels very differently. I'm going to give you an example. Pernah dengar perkataan Sino kah? Sino. Tahu kan perkataan Sino? Now, if you say, saya ni orang Sino, by and large, I would think you are from Sabah. Okay? Now, the Sarawakians also have something similar, but they do not use the word Sino the way Sabahans do. And Sino comes from the word sinology, means to have Chinese heritage. Di Sabah, the Sabah government memang sudah mencipta kategori ni lah. Alright, and only maybe about less than 10 years ago, dorang bilang, semua orang Sino adalah orang asal. Alright, so you can be Sino native, you can be Sino Kadazan, you can be Sino Dusun, you can even be Sino Murut. A very good friend of mine from the Key clan. For anybody dari Tawau, dari Kunak, dari Sampurna, you might have heard of keluarga Key, K-E-E. And the Key clan calls themselves Sino Suluk. Of course, because all Suluk people are assumed to be Muslim, just like Malay people, they say that that term doesn't exist, tidak boleh wujud, all right? Because Islam is a much stronger or prevailing identity than any other indigenous identity. However, Sino native is the easiest way to identify lah dorang kan. So a Sino native must choose, unfortunately, in some cases, either dorang Cina atau dorang orang asal. And what's worse is, if a Sino leaves Sabah, kerja kah, belajar kah, at a federal level, they are not recognized as Bumiputra. Right? Padahal punya ramai orang dari Sabah ni memang ada darah Sino. Right? For other indigenous groups, they are not listed by the state, but there are some indigenous claims that they can make. Macam orang Bajau Laut. What does it mean? If you are Bajau Laut or you're sea nomad, you're a sea Bajau, a lot of the Bajau Laut still live dalam keadaan yang memang papak kedana sampai hari ini. They have been used for political gains. Sometimes ada juga dorang pergi tangkap, but once they realize that they are Bajau Laut, memang dorang tinggal atas dorang punya boat, dorang tidak ada kacau lah. So sometimes if state of Sabah bilang we have some subsidy for certain groups, the Bajau Lauts will get it, but they are never listed as an ethnic identity, an official ethnic identity, because the state menganggap orang Bajau Laut tu gelandangan. Okay, so this is a contradiction, two ideas that cannot go hand in hand. And lastly, one of the other things is that there are many Indians in Sabah. Saya ingat lagi dulu, because my father is Indian. Saya ingat lagi dulu, my grandmother said when my mother brought my father home, dia bilang tidak pernah kami nampak orang India. Also, nobody calls Indians India in Sabah, but I will not use the term that is commonly used to call Indians in Sabah because it is widely accepted in Sabah, but is widely unacceptable in Semenanjung. Okay, and I find it funny because when I'm in Sabah, I use that term to explain things. However, what's interesting is up until 2010, the category of Indians have been included under orang asal for a very short time, and then dikasih keluar. Kali typo lah tu kan, but a typo can mean many things when people have to use those documents to make a claim sometimes. And this is what I mean by there are a lot of things where a lot of your identities are sort of in a shambles simply because of the kind of intervention, a top-down approach that the government has taken into defining identity and not having the perbincangan antara community to decide for themselves. So, what does this have to do with the sea? Banyaklah kau punya Dr. Vila, banyaklah yang dikasih tahu ni. Kepala saya pun sudah pusing-pusing sudah ni. Well, I'm going to make a point. I'm going to come to the end very soon so we can have a kupi-kupi session amongst us. Is that I think we have to understand. Now, for those of you, you know what this map is, kan? This is a map of Sabah, all right? And you will see some very prominent places within Sabah. But for many people, when we understand Sabah, Sabah is actually part of something we call the Sulu zone. You see this term, Sulu. Many people argue that actually Sabah is a part of this whole thing. But of course, modern day governments mean that our borders are cut here. And then of course, these guys over here are saying, no, come back. And then half of us are like, no, we want to stay. And then over here, these other cousins here, di sini orang Brunei ni bilang, kami ba yang kau punya original bapa ni? And then we're like, no, I don't think so. These are new carvings of new historical cleavages. And then down here, another cousin lagi, orang Kalimantan lagi. It's really complicated. And if you want to read more about Sabah's relationship to these three cousins, as I call them, there are many books that I can suggest later. But the core of it is that you're seeing a lot more blue than you are seeing brown or green. And that's because that's it. If this is basically the way Sabah sees itself, we need to understand that it's constantly sharing maritime borders, specifically with the Philippines. Of course, if we're talking about dari segi pandangan kerajaan, these relationships have significant security, economic, social consequences for Malaysia, right? For Malaysia. Tapi, if you're Sabahan, it involves you in a very different way of discussing rezeki, kau punya cara kehidupan, especially if you are coastal. Now, of course, the argument is, tapi kebanyakan kami ni tidaklah coastal, doktor ni, kami di tengah-tengah di sini. Well, that's not true. 1/3, officially 1/3 of all orang asal dari Sabah are maritime communities. All right. And I did this research a couple of years back, and then it was cited by a few people. And what I mean by 1/3 of it is we look at the Banci in relation to cultural practices and also original place of residence of the community. And what we found is 1/3. That's a lot. If there are 3.9 Sabahans, I guess including non-citizen, I'm saying 1.3 million Sabahans or celebrate maritime heritage. And this breaks the belief that groups are specific to a particular ethnicity only owing to space, right? That means it's not true that only the Kadazans live in one area. It's not true that the Muruts are only occupying one area. If there is a 1/3 possibility, it means there is an impact for almost every ethnic group to have a sub-ethnic group that is maritime-based. And we have to understand that Sabah, or North Borneo, as we've been called those days, naturally has a rich history on maritime activities, right? The North Bornean coastal areas were developed originally by the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British. Some of my friends fondly call them the penjajas. But you know, they served as during this time, they served as very important maritime centers, right? We had multiple pelbagai maritime centers, port maritim lah, right, for trade, for economic growth in our history. But even till today, right, and even historically, the way orang asal ramai community ni berkomunikasi kan is underdeveloped. Kami punya jalan raya ni memang teruk lah kalau di Sabah ni, okay, because Sabah is huge and we don't have enough resources. So seas and rivers, don't forget, banyak daripada kami punya sungai ni merupakan sungai air masin. So a lot of these oceanic waters, the sea waters are coming into our rivers, right? And that means that there is still a huge connection through these rivers with the maritime space. And it means communication, it means cari makanan, cari rezeki, right? It means also having land that is water. Banyak kami pikir, saya mau beli tanah ba ni? So tanah yang memang tanah yang saya boleh tanam pokok tu saja yang ada value. That's not true. Many communities look at the sea and they think that place has just as much as value as well, right? So when this is expanded to contemporary positions, today when we think about the sea is unfortunately linked to the way we think about issues of xenophobia. Xenophobia means satu perasaan yang sangat-sangat takut terhadap orang luar, and geopolitics of identity. We have, unfortunately, in Sabah, a very strong anti-migrant, anti-stateless, anti-undocumented narrative, all right? Simply because of the way politicians have told communities to think about themselves. So, kalau kami pikir, saya ini KDM dan Penikas, I am very different from the Suruks and Bajaus coming from Sandakan, Kunak, Lahad Datu, right? So you split the state in half. Well, what about orang dari Pitas? Orang dari dua-dua, bah? What about the people living along the Kinabatangan River? They will have to sort of bleed into both sides, right? So we create socio-political divisions. And apa ni, oftentimes kalau kau dari bahagian KK, you will think of orang di apa ni, on the other side of the East Coast ni as inhospitable and volatile, right? You will think of that area as dangerous because it's close to the Philippines, Project IC, banyak orang masuk dari pintu belakang, dada, and in some cases terrorism, right? There's been a lot of terrorist sightings in those areas. But we have to remember that that side of the coast is very rich with maritime cultures, the same maritime cultures that many KDMs over in KK might also celebrate, right? And we think that way because the migrants and our Sabah, our Suluk and Bajau cousins share very similar ethnicities or cultural heritages. And so they feel that they have also been treated very unfairly. So we think about this area as being turbulent. Memang banyak guncang lah, banyak goyang lah di banyak tempat dari segi politik. And because of that, we actually lose sight of a much larger, much more important conversation about being orang asal. Yeah. And on top of that, when we lose sight of ourselves, we treat outside people, or we treat people that we think are from the outside as dangerous. And so we treat them badly. But what I need you to remember is that the migrant issue and the indigenous issue in Sabah are not two separate issues that are fighting each other. They are part of the same, they're two ends of the same spectrum. Solve one, solve the other kind of scenario even. But unfortunately, we've got too many things on our plate. So how do you solve it, right? So how do we sort of recognize the need for change in relations to this? I know a lot of you are coming in and having this training about, storytelling and, looking at the environment as a way of informing us about our world. You need to remember that people are constantly telling stories about their lives, about dorang punya experience, dorang punya pengalaman dalam hidup, dorang punya dunia. And oftentimes these stories are more than just cerita dongeng. They have power. Stories are very powerful. When you listen and you understand, you have a very good idea about kami orang punya kelebihan dengan kekurangan. Our limitations and our, what's the opposite of limitations? I forgot the word, dyslexia. All right, yes, thank you. So that's generally where I'm at. Terima kasih banyak-banyak. Pasal saya ni banyak cakap. So, as my mother always say, marilah bincang, okay? Number one, think about it for a second, okay? What are your favorite stories about the sea? I don't know if we have time to do this. What does this tell you about being Sabahan? More importantly, what does this tell you about authorities? All right? About mereka yang berkuasa. And the last thing, why is this important? All right, think about the sea. What does it tell you about yourself? What does it tell you about people who govern you? Why is this important?